My name is Viktoriia Gorbunova. I'm a Ukrainian psychologist, researcher, and I want to share with you results of a study of the psychological consequences and transgenerational outcomes of the Holodomor, one of the most traumatic events in the history of Ukraine. The study was conducted together with my colleague Vitaly Klimchuk and supported by the Holodomor Research and Educational Consortium and the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Study. The term Holodomor in Ukrainian denotes a famine genocide provoked by the Soviet authority in 1932-33. The Holodomor was the largest man-made famine in Ukraine's history. The number of victims reached 7 million, according to different calculations. There were other mass famines inside and outside Ukraine, for instance, in the Kuban and Volga regions, where also those famines were also caused by the Stalin regime and aimed to eliminate Ukrainians. The Holodomor has been recognized in 34 countries around the world as a genocide attempt to eliminate the Ukrainian people by Soviet government. Transgenerational trauma involves a transfer of trauma outcomes from the first generation of survivors to the second and to further generations of descendants. Genocide, slavery, terrorism, and famine can result in transgenerational types of trauma. The most common consequences of transgenerational trauma, I mean psychological consequences, are psychological changes in future generations' worldview, values, self-attitudes, self-esteem, and behavioral patterns. Also can be affected the way of resolving daily problems and building relationship, making decision. The descendants of a trauma survivors can show emotional, cognitive, and behavioral patterns that can be connected to the original trauma. The main time of such trauma transmission over generation is social-cultural, through communication, socialization, observation, imitation, compassion, child treatment, community rules, etc. Different studies of transgenerational traumas point the range of changes. For example, Kellerman cites disruptive changes in self-cognition, affectivity, and interpersonal functioning in descendants of Holocaust survivors. Degree describes a particular kind of transgenerational trauma, the post-traumatic slave syndrome, a set of behaviors and beliefs, for example, general self-destructive outlook, learned helplessness, distorted self-concept, common in African Americans whose ancestors suffered from a long history of slavery and racism. The post-communist syndrome discovered by Kliperova, derived from the time of Soviet Union, is a pattern of symptoms that evoke a lack of civic culture and civic virtues in regard to tragedies in Czech students. Most studies of psychological consequences of the Holodomor focus on changes in behavior, moral attitudes, values, and worldview of second and next wave of descendants. Behavioral features of Holodomor descendants include irrational hoarding, stockpiling of excessive food supplies, an inability to discard unwanted and unneeded items, an extreme reverence for food, overeating, and a permanent state of anxiety regarding survival, according to research Bezo and Maggi. In terms of personal values, for example, Reva, Ukrainian researcher, observed that Holodomor descendants have a so-called national inferiority complex. For example, they compare their personal abilities unfavorably with the abilities of Russians. Again, Reva said that permanent fear of defeat and low level of aspiration also are features of such syndrome. There is evidence among Holodomor descendants to suggest the existence also a so-called Stockholm syndrome, a psychological alliance with the captures during captivity between the Ukrainian people and the aggressors, which results in the formation of worldview, the creation of Soviet value system, which originating from a fear of using, for example, Ukrainian language, and an impulse to appear to be loyal to any type of national identity. In our study, we chose post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, as a starting point for developing a research model. PTSD is a mental health disorder with specific symptoms that follows exposure to one or more traumatic events which were a threat to life. Individuals who suffer from PTSD persistently avoid traumatic-related thoughts and feelings, and also try to avoid objects and places that have connection with traumatic events. Also, trauma survivors have intrusive, distressing memories, so-called symptoms of trauma re-experience, memories, nightmares, flashbacks, emotional and physical reaction, as well as negative changes in mood and cognition. For example, negative beliefs or negative expectation. We understand that famine is a traumatic event with deadly outcomes. Many survivors of the Holodomor must have suffered PTSD symptoms. The question essential to our research model is how did PTSD symptoms pass through generations? We assumed that trauma reminders avoidance can possibly result in specific Holodomor-related storytelling behavioral within the families when no one in families or in very rare occasions wanted to share this information. Also, negative changes in mood and conditions likely to affect clinicians, likely to affect families' worldview attitudes in regard to the Holodomor, as well as behavioral strategies. So, research questions were which traumatic worldview attitudes and traumatic behavioral strategies have been passed to succeeding generations via copied behavior, conversations, nonverbal reaction, and decision-making styles. Also, which attitudes toward Holodomor-related events were inherited by later generations through the storytelling of the previous generation. Some statistic. Among participants whose families lived in the Holodomor impacted territory, 45% lost at least one family members. 79% mentioned life-threatening suffering of neighbors or distant relatives. 30% of our respondents reported that the family starved without danger to life, and only 4% of participants of our research cite an absence of any kind of suffering. We assumed that the avoidance of Holodomor-related storytelling is a feature connected with a trauma avoidance that can be transferred through generations. Two correlations between Holodomor storytelling and the death of neighbors or distant relatives, and correlations between Holodomor storytelling behavior and suffering without threat to life confirms this hypothesis. It was easier to talk about Holodomor events for individuals who did not have a close relationship with the victims. On the other hand, people who were Holodomor victims themselves tended to keep silent, and that tendency appeared in their offspring. The reason for this behavior is a high probability that Holodomor victims suffered from PTSD symptoms, and we remember that avoidance is one of the diagnostic criteria for PTSD according to all diagnostic and statistic manual. Also, indirect evidence in support of this hypothesis is seen in the frequency analysis of Holodomor-related storytelling within families who lived on striking areas. 84% of the participants of our research whose families lived in Holodomor striking areas reported absent or infrequent Holodomor-related storytelling, whereas only 16% of participants reported frequent and detailed Holodomor-related storytelling. Given that 45% of participants noted deaths in the family during the Holodomor, and 47 noted life-threatening circumstances during the Holodomor, we consider such results to be a social-cultural transmission of avoidance from the Holodomor generation to succeeding generation. Another research hypothesis is that families avoid discussing Holodomor-related events due to negative attitudes towards the topic. We think that the absence of true information and the presence of Soviet propaganda has significant impacts on awareness and attitudes towards the Holodomor, and that these attitudes were passed down through generations. The first proof can be seen in the correlation between the level of Holodomor-related storytelling within families from Holodomor-stricken territories and the attitudes of descendants of Holodomor survivors. Examples of such attitudes are reflected in the following statement, and you can see them on the presentation. I believe that the theme of the Holodomor is far-fetched because hunger and difficult living conditions were everywhere. I do not read about the Holodomor, and I am not interested in this topic. I do not light candles on the Holodomor anniversaries and do not support other traditions to commemorate the victims of those times. I avoid conversation on Holodomor-related topics. I think that during the Holodomor period, those who suffered were mostly lazy and alcoholics, those who did not want to work. I think that during the Holodomor period, those who suffered were those who did not go to the collective farm and who refused to work. Clearly, people who have not heard much about the Holodomor tend to devaluate and dishonor these events in conjunction with Soviet propaganda. The last two attitudes suggest the influence of the propaganda machine, which indicated such convenient excuses and explanations. From the Soviet point of view, suffering and death were not caused by authorities, but were seen as consequences of laziness and refusal to work. The diversity of answers about personal attitudes within the overall sample also shows results that support the hypothesis I mentioned before. For example, the higher indicators for all negative attitudes, with one exception, are shown by participants who do not know about the place of their family residence during the Holodomor. Such lack of knowledge about family can lead to avoidance of the traumatic event. The only attitude that is not in line with others is I do not read about the Holodomor. I do not have interest in this topic. More than half of our participants, 56% of those who do not know about the place of their family residence during the Holodomor, evaluated it as a distinct from their behaviors, actions, and beliefs. This means that people feel the lack of such knowledge and are trying to fill in this gap. The most prominent worldviews theme topic passed through generation is food. First of all, it is a good feeding. Children should always be well-fed. Food preserving, you have to make food preservation and always have a supply of food in the house. Food saving, you should not throw out bread and other food leftovers. Food cultivation, you need to have subsistence farming, grow vegetables and plant fruit trees. During the Holodomor, Ukrainians did not have sufficient food for survival and a healthy life. Food centration is a specific characteristic of Ukrainian daily lives. Every Ukrainian granny, when grandchildren came from the school, mandatory will ask them, "What did you eat?" Other worldview attitudes and behavioral strategies that are held by nearly 50% of survey participants are connected to different traumatic factors of the Holodomor. Their statements can be categorized following a Masluk classification of the depressive factor of the Holodomor. Masluk was the Ukrainian researcher who did kind of classification on all the distresses Ukrainians faced during the Holodomor. First of all, it's informational deprivation. And it could result in statement, "You cannot trust anyone, especially the authorities." I just will make a reminder that all these statements were derived during focus group interview. Living space limitations, one more depressive factors can result in you have to flee from here because there will not be anything good. You have to search for a better life elsewhere. You should not have more children than you can feed. Destruction of tradition, one more depressive factor, one of the strongest among which was the tradition of mutual help and support. And Soviet authority completely destroy this possibility to support each other during the Holodomor. This factor possibly to result in worldview, you have to first of all take care of the well-being of your family, and it's better not to interfere in matters that do not concern you personally, even when it comes to crime or dishonesty. Again, all the statements were found among our focus group participants. We can't be sure that they are only connected with the Holodomor event. The history of traumas in Ukraine actually is huge. Holodomor is not only one. Ukrainians have suffered a number of traumatic events in their history, mostly during the Soviet period. In the context of state terror, whereas collectivization, deportation and displacement, mass arrest and violence. This issue is a limitation of our study, and we accept it, and needs further exploration. In conclusion, the most prominent research results are the avoidance of speaking about the Holodomor is more common among families whose ancestors suffered from traumatic events. B. Negative personal attitudes to the Holodomor, avoidance and devaluation of Holodomor-related topics and actions are present among individuals who do not know much about the traumatic events during the Holodomor. The most widespread Holodomor-related worldview attitudes and behavioral patterns strategies within families correspond to trauma-related topics, such as child and family feeding patterns, preservation of food and supplies, distrust to authorities, toward authorities, disappointment in government, and importance of family needs versus community needs. Thank you very much. We'll be happy to have somehow your feedbacks and of course your questions.